92%. That is the share of the world's electric vehicle battery supply chain, linked to one country's processing capacity. Not a rough estimate. A measured vulnerability index published in 2024 in Nature Communications. 92%. Around 70% of all mined lithium on Earth is refined there. 75% of every lithium-ion battery ever built comes out of its factories. And 58% of the world's lithium reserves sit in just 3 countries: Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia, a triangle drawn across the driest desert on the planet. This is supposed to be the clean energy revolution, the opposite of oil, the mineral that frees us from geopolitical chokepoints and resource wars. We have been told for 30 years that the future is electric. What we were not told is what the future runs on, or who controls it, or what it costs. Not in dollars, but in water, in land, in the communities living directly above the most contested resource since crude. This is the story of how the world built a new dependency, one rational decision at a time, and how the obvious blind spot was hiding in the periodic table the whole time. Lithium is element number 3, the lightest metal in existence. So soft you can cut it with a kitchen knife. So reactive it ignites in air and burns in water. Discovered in 1817 by Swedish chemist Johann August Arfwedson, it spent most of its history as an industrial curiosity, used in the production of glass, in ceramics, in aircraft lubricants, in the psychiatric treatment of bipolar disorder. Then, in 1991, Sony released the first commercial lithium-ion battery. It was lighter than anything before it, held more charge, and could be recharged hundreds of times without significant degradation. The electronics industry rebuilt itself around that chemistry within a decade. Laptops, digital cameras, mobile phones. The lithium-ion battery became the invisible substrate of the consumer technology era, quietly inside every device, never advertised, never questioned. But it was the electric vehicle that changed the scale of everything. And when the industry looked at where the supply would come from, they found, sitting at 2,300 meters above sea level in the Atacama Desert, what the industry would come to call white gold. The Salar de Atacama is an ancient, hyper-arid salt flat, 40,000 square miles of salt crust overlying a vast underground brine, water saturated with lithium, potassium, and magnesium that has been concentrating for millions of years beneath the driest non-polar desert on Earth. You don't mine it the way you mine iron or copper. You drill into the aquifer, pump the brine to the surface, and let it evaporate under the Andean sun in vast rectangular ponds. After months of evaporation, what remains is lithium carbonate, white as chalk. Chile recognized the strategic weight of this resource long before anyone else. In 1979, the government declared lithium a strategic national asset, exempt from ordinary mining law. Only 2 foreign companies were ever granted the special extraction contracts to operate in the Atacama Salar: SQM, a Chilean chemical company, and Albemarle, an American specialty chemicals firm. 2 contracts, 2 companies. The entire world's battery future flowing through them. The lithium triangle, Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia together, holds 58% of the world's identified lithium resources, roughly 90 million tons in total by recent USGS estimates. Bolivia alone sits on 21 million tons. Argentina and Chile hold tens of millions more, with Chile's deposits the smallest in volume, but by far the richest in concentration and the easiest to reach. In the early days, this looked like a gift, a clean mineral in the ground in stable democracies, waiting to power the transition away from fossil fuels. The beginning of every good story looks exactly like this. In 2008, Evo Morales drew a line. Bolivia's socialist president declared that the Salar de Uyuni, 100 miles of crystalline salt flat, holding 21 million tons of lithium, the largest single lithium deposit in the world, would not be open to foreign capital. The state would develop it alone, on Bolivian terms, with Bolivian technology. No multinationals, no extractive contracts. Nearly 2 decades later, Bolivia produces less than 1% of the world's lithium supply. The lesson the global battery industry drew from Bolivia was not about sovereignty. It was about dependency. If you relied on a politically uncertain government, you got nothing. So, the industry concentrated its bets on Chile, which had a working legal framework, an established contract structure, and two companies already pulling brine from the sailor. SQM's contract running until 2030. Albemarle's running until 2043. Two documents. The legal spine of the global battery supply chain. Meanwhile, below the surface of the Atacama, something was happening that did not appear in any prospectus or supply chain audit. The brine aquifer, the same ancient water table in which the lithium was dissolved, was beginning to drop. Scientific studies documented significant groundwater drawdown in the most heavily pumped zones. Satellite instruments detected measurable surface subsidence across the sailor. Studies of the Atacama Basin found that mining operations, lithium extraction chief among them, account for the majority of total water use in this hyper-arid region. And the brine evaporation process for producing lithium is extraordinarily water-intensive, requiring enormous volumes per ton of lithium extracted, in a desert where some zones receive no measurable rainfall. The environmental monitoring reports existed. The community feedback existed. The companies were not hiding anything. The data was filed. It just was not in any headline. And in Asia, the scale was changing in ways that made all of this more urgent. China had declared electric vehicles a national strategic priority. State-backed companies were acquiring mineral rights abroad, building refining capacity at a scale no other country matched, and integrating the supply chain from upstream mine to finished battery cell. By the time the rest of the world looked up, China was refining 60% of all mined lithium on Earth and assembling 3/4 of all lithium-ion battery cells. The foundation was being laid. Nobody was reading the fine print. The pivotal moment did not look pivotal. It looked like an acquisition. In 2018, Tianqi Lithium, one of China's largest state-backed mining corporations, paid approximately $4 billion to acquire a 23.8% stake in SQM, the company holding one of the only two active extraction contracts in the world's richest lithium sailor. The deal was reviewed. Antitrust screens were applied. It cleared. A Chinese state-connected company now owned nearly a quarter of the most strategically important lithium source in the Western Hemisphere. Washington noticed. Brussels noticed. Neither acted with urgency. What made this moment pivotal was not the purchase itself. It was what the purchase revealed about the structure beneath everything else. Because when you trace the full path from the brine pump in the Atacama to the battery cell in an electric vehicle, from mine to refinery to cathode to assembly, you found the same country at every node. 60% of all mined lithium refined in China, 70% of global cathode capacity in China, 85% of global anode capacity in China, 75% of all battery cells assembled in China. And demand was about to scale in a way that would make those concentrations effectively permanent. By that point, US companies alone had announced hundreds of billions of dollars in electric vehicle transition investments. Ford, General Motors, Tesla, Stellantis. Europe's automakers pledged their own hundreds of billions. Every one of those bets required lithium. Virtually none of those supply chains had been rerouted around the chokepoints. The IEA had published the models. Senate committees had held the hearings. Supply chain consultancies had written the reports. The fine print was in every public document. It was just never in a headline. By 2021, the top 5 electric vehicle battery producers, a list dominated by Chinese firms, controlled the vast majority of global output. One disruption at the right node, and the cascade would touch every car factory on Earth. This is what a monopoly looks like when it is built quietly, reasonably, one rational decision at a time. Then the world woke up. Between 2020 and 2022, the price of lithium carbonate went from roughly $10,000 per metric ton to more than $70,000. A 7-fold surge in under 2 years, driven by an EV boom that outran even the most optimistic forecasts. Every major automaker announced full electrification targets. Every major government announced combustion engine phase-out dates. The Inflation Reduction Act directed hundreds of billions of dollars toward the transition. The IEA calculated that under a net zero scenario, global demand for lithium would need to rise more than 40-fold by 2040. 40 times the current supply, within a generation. But here is what the surge revealed. The concentration did not dilute under pressure. It intensified. Every dollar of new EV investment flowed through the same choke points. Every new battery factory needed cathode materials processed in the same refineries. The boom made the fragility briefly visible, and then, almost immediately, buried it again under press releases and stock charts. In 2022, lithium briefly became the world's best-performing commodity. Mining companies reported record profits. Governments rushed to sign new supply agreements. New projects were announced in Chile, Argentina, Australia, Nevada. The 7 to 10 year timeline to bring a new mine from discovery into production appeared in footnotes, if at all. The clean energy boom was real. The structural fragility underneath it was equally real. And the two facts did not cancel each other out. They compounded. In the Atacama, the evaporation ponds were expanding. The aquifer was dropping. The communities above the salar were beginning to count what was being taken and what could never be returned. On the 20th of April, 2023, Gabriel Boric stood before cameras in Santiago and told Chile what it already owned. The national lithium strategy, he announced, would require the Chilean state to hold at least 51% in any new lithium project. Not full nationalization, a majority stake in the future. Any new contract, any new concession, any new partnership would have the state at the table with a controlling voice. The state copper company, Codelco, would lead negotiations. A new national lithium company would eventually take shape. The markets reacted as markets do. SQM's share price dropped. Albemarle's fell. The word nationalization circulated in every financial headline, even though what Boric had actually announced was more modest and in some ways more durable. A new framework for who would control the next 30 years of extraction. Wall Street had a word for it. Santiago had a word for it. What neither said that day was what it looked like 3,000 kilometers north. In the Atacama, the communities most affected by lithium production are not the shareholders of SQM. They are the Licanante, the Atacameño people, who have lived above the salar for thousands of years. And for the communities nearest the brine pumps, the announcement in Santiago did not change what they could already see. Rivers that once ran year-round had stopped running, not from drought alone. The aquifer beneath the salt flat, the same brine system being pumped into evaporation ponds, had been drawn down significantly by years of extraction, documented by hydrogeological studies and satellite measurements showing measurable surface subsidence across the most heavily pumped zones. Studies of the Atacama Basin found that mining operations, lithium extraction foremost among them, account for the majority of water consumption in this hyper-arid region. In a desert where some zones receive no measurable rainfall, and the brine evaporation process requires enormous volumes of water per ton of lithium produced. The lagoons where flamingos nested had shrunk. The vicuñas that once grazed the margins of the salt flat found less pasture each year. In one Kala community living at the edge of the affected zone, reports describe a large share of residents having already abandoned ancestral land and moved to the city of Copiapó. Researchers describe the lost water as irreversible. Once pumped and evaporated from this closed basin, it would not return. The communities above the brine had not been the primary signatories of the agreements governing their water table. Consultation had been limited. Their legal standing under the existing contract framework was weak relative to the interests of industrial extractors. So, when the president stood before the cameras to announce that Chile's lithium belonged to the Chilean people, the people who lived directly above the lithium had already been living with the costs of that claim for more than a decade. The announcement spoke to ownership of the mineral. It did not speak to what ownership of the mineral had already cost. This is the hinge of the story, not the politics, the structure. By 2024, the architecture of the clean energy supply chain had settled into a new shape, one that almost no one had planned and almost everyone had rationalized. Codelco and SQM reached an agreement. The state copper company would take 50% plus one share of the joint venture operating Atacama Lithium, majority control. And in exchange, SQM's operating contract, which had been set to expire in 2030, was extended to 2060, 3 more decades of extraction at the world's richest salar. Under state majority control, yes. But under the same fundamental model, brine pumping, evaporation ponds, and an aquifer with no recharge rate, Chile mapped 69 salt flats under the National Lithium Strategy. The government received 88 expressions of interest from 54 companies across 10 countries. The world still wanted access. The framework had changed. The demand had not. And through all of this, the supply chain concentrated further. In 2024, a peer-reviewed study published in Nature Communications quantified something the industry had long understood but never stated so precisely. For lithium iron phosphate chemistry, the type used in hundreds of millions of EV and grid storage batteries, China's share of cathode production was 92%. For nickel manganese cobalt chemistry, the vulnerability index traced through lithium refining reached approximately 80%. These numbers came from peer-reviewed science, not advocacy, not policy papers, science. Here is the acidic fact at the center of this story. The clean energy transition, sold to the public as liberation from the geopolitical leverage of petrostates, from resource wars, from the fragility of fossil fuel monopolies, has produced a new monopoly, one that is more concentrated at its critical nodes than the global oil market has been at any point in the modern era. The world's oil supply is spread across dozens of producing countries. The world's EV battery cathode supply is 92% tied to one country's processing capacity, and the time required to build an alternative, 7 to 10 years to bring a single new mine online, decades to shift industrial refining capacity, means that any major supply disruption is not a short-term market shock. It is a structural crisis that arrives without warning and resolves without speed. The United States has responded with escalating tariffs on Chinese automotive and battery products. Expensive, slow remedies for a dependency that was decades in the making. Nobody designed this. No single corporation engineered it. No government policy intended it. It emerged from thousands of rational choices, made by thousands of rational actors, each optimizing for the best available option at the moment of decision. That is not a defense. That is the indictment. Return to the salt flat. The evaporation ponds reflect the cloudless Andean sky. They are blue and turquoise and pale at the edges where the lithium crystallizes, geometrically perfect, absolutely still. From above, they look like a painting. From the dry riverbed of a community that has lived here for thousands of years, they look different. The lithium that left this desert is now inside a battery. That battery is inside an electric vehicle, or a grid storage unit, or a phone, or a laptop. Someone may be reading about the climate crisis on it right now. It is tempting to call this corporate greed, or geopolitical failure, or the betrayal of an indigenous community. Elements of all of those things are real, but none of them is the whole story, because every actor in this story made the rational choice. Every company optimized for cost. Every government subsidized demand without securing supply. Every mining contract was filed, reviewed, and signed according to the laws in place. Every quarterly earnings call told shareholders what they wanted to hear. Every policy announcement framed the transition as liberation. And 30 years of rational choices, stacked end to end, produced a supply chain 92% tied to one country's processing capacity, built on an aquifer that cannot be refilled in a desert where the rivers have already stopped running. The fossil fuel era also began with promise. It also produced monopolies that appeared from the inside like efficiency. It also externalized its costs onto communities that had no seat at the table. And the people who built that system were not, in the main, villains. They were engineers and executives and ministers of energy, making the best decisions available to them at the time. We replaced that story with a cleaner one, and then we built the same structure underneath it. Read the fine print. It was there the whole time.